In the bitter winter of 1854, when snow blanketed the hills of rural Kentucky for 3 straight months, something impossible happened at Red Creek Church. While congregation members huddled in their thick coats, shivering through Sunday sermons, 3 wooden pews in the back remained mysteriously warm to the touch. Not lukewarm, not simply less cold, genuinely warm, as if heated by an invisible fire that never died. Sister Martha Henley, the church's devoted caretaker for 20 years, first noticed this phenomenon during a particularly harsh February morning when the temperature had dropped to 15 degrees below zero. But what she would discover about those pews would shake the very foundations of everything she believed about her community's past. Before we uncover the dark secret hidden within the walls of Red Creek Church, if you're brave enough to hear this story of forbidden warmth and buried sins, make sure to subscribe to Dark Heritage Files and hit the bell icon so you don't miss any of our spine-chilling tales. And please, let us know in the comments what city and country you're listening from. We love connecting with our global community of mystery lovers. Now, let's step into the shadows of 1854 Kentucky. The mystery that would consume Martha Henley's final years began on a morning that seemed no different from any other in the small farming community of Red Creek. According to the fragmentary records that survived in the church's archives and the whispered memories passed down through generations, what happened that winter would forever change how the people of Red Creek understood their own history. Red Creek was nothing more than a cluster of modest farms scattered across the rolling hills of eastern Kentucky, where tobacco fields stretched between dense forests of oak and hickory. The community consisted of barely 200 souls, most of them hard-working Baptist families who had settled the area in the early 1800s. Their lives revolved around the seasons, planting in spring, tending crops through summer, harvesting in fall, and enduring the harsh Appalachian winters huddled around their fireplaces. The Red Creek Baptist Church stood at the heart of this community, a simple wooden structure built in 1832 with hand-hewn logs and a steep shingled roof. The building was modest but solid, with 12 rows of wooden pews arranged in 2 sections facing a plain wooden pulpit. The church had been constructed entirely by the men of the congregation, using timber from their own lands and craftsmanship passed down from their fathers. Sister Martha Henley had been caring for this sacred space since 1834, when she was just 25 years old. A spinster by choice rather than circumstance, Martha had devoted her life to the church after her fiancé died in a logging accident. She arrived each morning before dawn to sweep the floors, dust the pews, and ensure everything was prepared for worship. Her dedication was legendary among the congregation. Some said she knew every grain of wood in those pews, every creak of the floorboards, every way the morning light fell through the windows. Martha was a woman of few words but keen observation. She had watched 3 pastors come and go, seen babies baptized who grew up to have children of their own, and witnessed the quiet tragedies and small triumphs that marked rural life. The church was her world, and she protected it with fierce devotion. The winter of 1854 was particularly brutal. Snow began falling in early December and continued with relentless persistence through February. The Kentucky hills became a white wilderness, and the small community of Red Creek found itself nearly isolated from the outside world. Church attendance, usually robust, dwindled to only the most devoted members who could brave the treacherous conditions. It was during this harsh season that Martha first noticed something unusual about 3 specific pews in the back of the church. February 14, 1854, dawned gray and bitter, with a wind that cut through the valley like a blade. Martha arrived at the church that morning to find the building as cold as a tomb, her breath visible in white puffs as she moved through the familiar routine of preparation. She had expected to find ice crystals on the windows and frost covering the wooden surfaces, as had become common during this endless winter. But when she reached the back section of the church to begin her cleaning, something made her stop. 3 pews. The 9th, 10th, and 11th rows on the left side felt different beneath her touch. Not cold as everything else in the building was, but warm. genuinely warm. Martha pulled off her heavy wool mittens and placed her bare hands on the smooth wood of the 9th pew. The warmth was unmistakable, radiating up through the timber as if a fire burned somewhere within the wood itself. Confused, she moved to the 10th pew, then the 11th. Both exhibited the same inexplicable warmth. She checked the other pews in the church methodically, running her hands along each one. Every other surface was ice-cold, exactly as she would expect in an unheated building during a February freeze. Only those 3 pews maintained their mysterious warmth. Martha's first thought was that there might be some practical explanation. Perhaps hot pipes running beneath the floor, or some trick of the building's construction that trapped heat in that particular area. But Red Creek Church had no heating system beyond the small wood stove near the pulpit, and the 3 warm pews were positioned too far from that source to benefit from its heat. When the small congregation gathered for that Sunday service, Martha mentioned her discovery to Pastor William Crawford, an earnest young man who had been leading the church for only 8 months. Pastor Crawford dismissed her concerns with a gentle smile, suggesting that perhaps the wood in those particular pews had been treated with some kind of preservative that made them feel different in cold weather. But Martha knew wood. She had been caring for these pews for 20 years, and they had never exhibited this behavior before. Over the following days, as the brutal winter continued, Martha found herself drawn repeatedly to those 3 pews. The warmth never varied, not hot enough to be uncomfortable, but consistently warm to the touch, as if the wood itself possessed some internal source of heat. She began to notice other oddities as well. Snow would melt more quickly on the roof directly above those pews, and the small area around them seemed to stay slightly warmer than the rest of the church. The phenomenon began to attract attention from the congregation. Word spread through the small community about the warm pews, and some members began to seek them out during services, grateful for the inexplicable comfort they provided during the harsh winter. Others, however, viewed the warmth with suspicion, whispering that it was unnatural and perhaps even unholy. Martha found herself becoming obsessed with understanding the mystery. She began arriving at the church even earlier each morning, spending long hours examining the 3 pews, looking for any clue that might explain their unusual property. As February gave way to March and the snows finally began to recede, the mystery of the warm pews continued to dominate conversation in Red Creek. Some congregation members embraced the phenomenon as a blessing, a sign of God's provision during the harsh winter. Others whispered that something unnatural was at work, that the church might be tainted by some dark influence. Martha noticed that the warmth in the pews seemed to affect people differently. Children were drawn to them instinctively, often falling asleep during long sermons when seated in those particular spots. But some adults reported feeling uneasy when sitting there, describing a sensation of being watched or an inexplicable heaviness in their chests. The church's elderly deacon, Thomas Whitmore, who had been part of the congregation since its founding, began to act strangely whenever the warm pews were mentioned. Martha observed him avoiding that section of the church entirely, choosing to stand at the back rather than sit near the mysterious rows. When she asked him about it, his response was evasive, mentioning only that some things were better left undisturbed. It was during her investigation of the pews that Martha first discovered the loose floorboard. While examining the area beneath the 9th pew, she noticed that one board moved slightly when she stepped on it. Working carefully with a poker from the church's wood stove, she managed to pry up the board, revealing a small hollow space beneath. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, she found a collection of items that made no immediate sense. 3 small wooden crosses, each carved with initials she didn't recognize, a leather pouch containing what appeared to be coins of unusual design, and a folded piece of paper covered in handwriting she couldn't decipher in the dim light. Martha's heart raced as she examined these hidden objects. Clearly someone had deliberately concealed them beneath the church floor, but why? And what connection, if any, did they have to the warm pews above? She carefully rewrapped the items and replaced them in their hiding place, but her mind churned with questions. Who had hidden these things? When? And why beneath these particular pews? That evening, Martha made a decision that would change everything. She would investigate the history of those 3 pews, tracing their origins and construction to understand why they alone possessed this mysterious warmth. Martha's investigation began with the church's construction records, such as they were. Red Creek Baptist Church had been built by volunteers from the congregation with materials donated by local families. The record-keeping had been haphazard, consisting mainly of informal notes and receipts kept in a wooden box in the pastor's study. After hours of searching through these documents, Martha discovered something significant. The original construction records indicated that most of the church's pews had been built from oak timber harvested from the Henley family land, her own family's property. But 3 pews, the 9th, 10th and 11th rows on the left side, had been constructed from lumber donated by a man named Samuel Morrison, whose property lay 5 miles north of the church. Martha remembered the Morrison place, though Samuel had died years ago and the property had been sold to outsiders. It had been a larger farm than most in the area, with a substantial 2-story house that had been considered quite grand by Red Creek standards. But something about the Morrison property had always seemed to make the older residents uncomfortable, though Martha had never understood why. Determined to learn more, Martha approached Deacon Whitmore again, this time pressing him more directly about the Morrison family and their connection to the church. The old man's reaction was immediate and telling. His face went pale, and he stammered something about not speaking ill of the dead before hurrying away. But Martha's persistence eventually paid off. She found an ally in Mrs. Eleanor Kessler, Samuel Morrison's elderly sister who had moved to Red Creek after her brother's death. Mrs. Kessler was in her 70s and had been present during the church's construction. More importantly, she had been living in her brother's house during the period when the lumber was donated. Over tea in Mrs. Kessler's modest cabin, Martha learned the first piece of the puzzle. Samuel Morrison's house, she discovered, had been more than just a grand residence. It had served as a station on the Underground Railroad, providing shelter and assistance to enslaved people seeking freedom in the North. Samuel was a God-fearing man, Mrs. Kessler explained, her voice barely above a whisper. He believed that helping those poor souls escape bondage was his Christian duty. The house had a hidden room in the cellar, and over the years, dozens of fugitives found shelter there. Martha felt a chill run down her spine. The Underground Railroad had been active in Kentucky during the 1840s and early 1850s, but she had never imagined that her own community had been involved in such dangerous work. Mrs. Kessler continued, "When Samuel died in 1851, the new owners had no interest in continuing that work. They tore down parts of the house, including the hidden room, and sold the lumber. Samuel's dying wish was that some of that wood be used to build pews for the church as a memorial to the people who had found hope within those walls." The revelation sent Martha's mind racing. The warm pews had been built from lumber that had once provided shelter to people fleeing slavery. But this knowledge only deepened the mystery. Why would that explain the warmth? And what connection did it have to the hidden objects she had found? Armed with this new knowledge, Martha returned to the church with a different perspective. She examined the 3 pews more carefully, looking for any signs of their unusual origin. It was then that she noticed something she had missed before. Small marks carved into the wood, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. Using a candle for better light, Martha discovered that each of the 3 pews contained similar markings. Sets of initials carved discreetly into the wood, always in groups of 3. The initials were JW, SB, and MR on the 9th pew, TJ, RH, and AL on the 10th, and EP, DK, and LM on the 11th. 9 sets of initials, 3 on each pew. 9 people whose names had been permanently etched into the wood that had once sheltered them. Martha's investigation took on new urgency. She began to seek out the oldest residents of Red Creek, asking careful questions about the Morrison property and the Underground Railroad. What she learned painted a picture of a community that had been more deeply involved in the dangerous work of helping enslaved people escape than she had ever imagined. But she also began to uncover hints of something darker. Several elderly residents, when pressed, mentioned that the Underground Railroad activity in the area had ended abruptly in late 1850. They spoke in whispers about a terrible night when something had gone wrong, but none would provide details. It was during one of these conversations that Martha learned about the 3 missing fugitives. According to Mary Hutchinson, whose father had been one of Samuel Morrison's closest friends, 3 enslaved people had arrived at the Morrison house on a cold October night in 1850. They were supposed to be moved north to the next station within 2 days, but something had gone wrong. They never made it to the next station, Mary explained, her voice trembling. Samuel was beside himself with worry. He sent out search parties, contacted other conductors on the railroad, but those 3 people simply vanished. It was like they disappeared into thin air. Martha felt a growing sense of dread. "What were their names?" she asked. Mary shook her head. "I don't know. Papa never spoke their real names. It was too dangerous. But I remember he mentioned that one was a young woman, maybe 20 years old, and the other 2 were men, brothers, I think." The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to form a picture, but it was one that Martha wasn't sure she wanted to complete. The warm pews, the carved initials, the hidden objects, and now the story of 3 missing fugitives. It all seemed connected, but the connection suggested something terrible. That night, Martha made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She would return to the church alone and examine the hidden objects more carefully. She needed to understand what had happened to those 3 missing people and why their story was somehow connected to the mysterious warmth in the pews. On a moonless night in late March, Martha returned to Red Creek Church with a lantern and a determination to uncover the truth. The building was eerily quiet, and the 3 pews seemed to radiate their mysterious warmth even more noticeably in the darkness. She carefully removed the loose floorboard and retrieved the hidden objects. By lamplight, she examined each item methodically. The 3 wooden crosses were crude, but carved with obvious care. The initials on them were clearer now: JW, SB, and MR. The same initials carved into the 9th pew. The leather pouch contained not coins, as she had first thought, but 3 small metal tokens, each bearing a different design. Martha recognized them as freedom papers, the forged documents that enslaved people carried to prove their right to travel freely. But it was the folded paper that contained the most devastating revelation. Written in a shaky hand that Martha recognized as belonging to Samuel Morrison, it was a confession that had been hidden beneath the church floor for over 3 years. The letter revealed the terrible truth about the 3 missing fugitives. On the night of October 15, 1850, 3 enslaved people had arrived at the Morrison house as planned. Their names were Joshua Washington, Samuel Brown, and Mary Robinson. The initials JW, SB, and MR carved into the 9th pew. But that same night, word had reached Samuel that slave catchers were active in the area, conducting searches of suspected Underground Railroad stations. Panicked and fearing for the safety of his entire network, Samuel had made a decision that would torment him for the rest of his life. Instead of moving the 3 fugitives to the next station as planned, he had hidden them in a secret chamber beneath his house, telling them they would be moved within a day or 2. But the slave catchers had remained in the area for weeks, and Samuel had been too terrified to risk moving his charges. The 3 people had remained hidden in the cramped, dark chamber for over a month, supplied with food and water by Samuel, but unable to leave their hiding place. When the slave catchers finally moved on, it was too late. The prolonged confinement in the damp, unventilated space had taken its toll. Martha's hands shook as she read Samuel's confession. All 3 fugitives had died in that hidden chamber, not from violence or capture, but from the conditions of their concealment. They had died of fever and lung sickness, their bodies weakened by weeks of hiding in a space barely large enough for 1 person, let alone 3. Samuel had buried them secretly on his property, telling no one what had happened. The guilt had consumed him for the remaining months of his life. When he died in 1851, his final act was to ensure that the wood from the room where the three had died would be used to build pews in the church as a memorial to their sacrifice. But the confession contained one final chilling detail. Samuel believed that the warmth in the pews was not supernatural, but came from the love and hope that the three fugitives had carried with them, even in their final moments. He wrote that they had spent their last days not in anger or despair, but in prayer, singing hymns softly to comfort each other and maintaining their faith that freedom would come, if not in this life, then in the next. Martha sat in the dark church for hours after reading Samuel Morrison's confession, the warm pews seeming to radiate not just heat, but the weight of untold sacrifice. She understood now why the three rows had always felt different, why children were drawn to them, and why some adults felt uneasy in their presence. The warmth wasn't supernatural. It was the physical manifestation of three people's final hopes and dreams, somehow preserved in the wood that had witnessed their last days. The pews had been built not just from lumber, but from the timber that had absorbed the prayers, songs, and quiet courage of Joshua Washington, Samuel Brown, and Mary Robinson. Martha made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She would not reveal the full truth about the warm pews to the congregation. The story was too painful, too complex, and too dangerous for a community that was still divided on the issue of slavery. Instead, she would honor the memory of the three fugitives in her own way. She carefully returned the confession and artifacts to their hiding place, but not before memorizing every detail. She began to arrive at the church even earlier each morning, spending time in quiet prayer at the three warm pews. She would sit in each one, speaking softly to the memory of the three people whose sacrifice had made them sacred. Over the years that followed, Martha noticed that the warmth in the pews gradually began to fade. By the time of her own death in 1867, only the faintest trace of unusual heat remained. It was as if the wood itself had finally found peace, having delivered its message to someone who understood its significance. The mystery of the warm pews at Red Creek Church died with Martha Henley. The confession remained hidden beneath the 9th pew until the church was demolished in 1923, and the documents were lost when the old building was torn down. But those who knew Martha in her later years often remarked on the change in her character after that winter of 1854, how she seemed to carry herself with a deeper sense of purpose, as if she had been entrusted with a sacred responsibility. The story of Joshua Washington, Samuel Brown, and Mary Robinson, three people whose names were never recorded in any official history, whose sacrifice was never acknowledged by the world, lived on only in the memory of one devoted woman who understood that sometimes the greatest acts of courage happen in silence, and that the warmest places in our world are often built from the hope of those who never lived to see their freedom. This story reminds us that history is filled with untold sacrifices and hidden courage. The three people whose memory warmed those pews at Red Creek Church were never famous, never remembered in textbooks, but their faith and hope created something that lasted long after their deaths. What do you think about this story? Do you believe that places can hold the memory of the people who suffered and hoped within their walls? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this tale of hidden history and want to hear more stories like this, subscribe to Dark Heritage Files, hit the bell icon, and share this video with someone who appreciates the power of untold stories. Until next time, remember that every old building has secrets, and sometimes the warmest places hold the deepest truths.